Well, we're glad to have you here. To my friend from Kentucky, I would just ask you, are you or any of our colleagues on our side of the aisle, to the best of your knowledge, against telework?
Absolutely not.
And the purpose of this is to restore pre-pandemic order with respect to telework, but then allow for the agencies to then present to Congress, hey, here's how we believe telework fits into our overall plan.
There's no plan now.
Right.
It's just being taken advantage of.
And the concern, I gather, is that that is maybe effective in some agencies, but abused in other agencies. And we have this, I think it's called oversight responsibility as Congress to go check the agencies and say, hey, how are you using this? And so just to clarify for the good of all, this fairly simple measure that I think the other gentleman from Kentucky outlined as being fairly simple and modest is to, again, return to pre-pandemic stage, have agencies present a plan, and then be able to effectuate whatever plan from that point forward.
Absolutely. Return to pre-pandemic levels. 22% will still be eligible for teleworking. And let's start measuring this. Let's measure the productivity when they come back to work and see what it looks like. And then if it goes down, then maybe we can talk about more teleworking, but we need to have that hearing. I like the idea of the hearing on excess office space. You know, that's an area that we need to examine to see if there's an opportunity to cut spending in the federal government. And I think the mayor of Washington would support that as well. So, but there's a statistic, Mr. Roy, if I may, from the Washington Free Beacon. This was June 17th, 2022. In the first months of the coronavirus pandemic, a quarter, 25% of employees at the federal government's top health agency failed to even check their emails as they worked remotely. And that's according to internal documents obtained by Washington Free Beacon. And they're talking about the Department of Health and Human Services. 25% neglected to even log on to the agency's software between March 2020 and December 2020. So I have no doubt there are employees that thrive working from home, but there are employees that have not been productive. I ran a government agency prior to coming to Congress. I ran the Kentucky Department of Agriculture. We had employees that worked in the office, and we had employees that worked from home. And I can tell you, there's some employees that can thrive working from home without supervision, and there's some that just can't. And we've got a lot of government agencies, according to all of our caseworkers, those of us who have been here before COVID and after COVID will testify that there are a lot of agencies that just have gotten behind and they're not catching up. And we believe bringing them back in to work is a solution to the problem.
The gentleman from Kentucky, would he agree that there's been a lot of discussion about holding civilian workforce accountable, right? You know, do your job, don't do your job. I think it was the ranking member who said that. How easy is it to fire the civilian workforce?
Very, the civilian workforce?
I mean, I'm sorry, the government workforce.
It's very difficult.
Yeah.
Very difficult, and there were laws passed through the House last Congress. I don't know if they made it through the Senate or not, that made it even more difficult. We argued that we tried to pass legislation to make it easier to fire poor performers. But it's very difficult to hold a poor government employee accountable.
Would the gentleman from Kentucky choose to hire more IRS agents to effectuate getting tax returns and refunds back to taxpayers, or would he choose not having a system in which the American taxpayer has to loan their money to the government, waiting one day to get a refund back in the first place?
The latter.
Right. Perhaps simplifying the tax code, perhaps choosing a tax system that doesn't allow us to have our dollars sitting in the Treasury waiting for some bureaucrat in Washington to hopefully one day give it back to me would be a better angle rather than hiring more bureaucrats to process said tax returns in the first instance. On the issue of proxy voting, I would note that by my count, by my staff, there were 371 votes eligible for proxy voting, 13,889 votes cast by proxy. Of those, approximately 8.7% of votes were cast by proxy, 4% of total Republicans, 13% of total Democrats. Of the 4 members of this committee, for example, 3 did in fact vote by proxy on, for example, the $1.7 trillion omnibus spending bill. I would note that the omnibus spending bill passed with a quorum of proxy votes. So the American taxpayer should know that this body, the People's House, spent $1.7 trillion of their money and borrowed money, passed by 226 votes on December 23rd, heading out for Christmas. That was how the People's House was operating in December. Now, the question arises about whether or not individuals were voting by proxy and whether it's hypocritical or not. So I never voted by proxy. I understand why some colleagues chose not to as well or chose to. Why might that be? I had a situation where I had given my word to give a speech in Charlottesville, Virginia, my alma mater, the University of Virginia. And we were waiting around during the transportation votes about 16 months ago. And I was stuck. I drove to Fredericksburg, Virginia, sat in a coffee shop, waiting for the Democratic majority to decide what vote we were going to have on that night, Friday night, as it were, so I could decide if I had to quickly sprint to Charlottesville to honor my commitment or quickly sprint back to D.C. to actually cast my vote in person on a vote that was likely going to be close. Why do I tell that story? Because would the gentleman from Kentucky agree that if an institution adopts something like proxy voting, that you then change the culture of the institution such that it becomes very easy for those who are promoting the proxy voting to determine the schedule, the floor schedule, in light of how they will be able to operate if, for example, there's a friendly colleague who lives close to the confines here who will vote for 10 members at a time, that would change the entire dynamic so that those of us who are, say, from Texas or otherwise having to figure out what we're going to do, you're then forced to make a decision. I chose not to, but I understand why some colleagues said, well, they're doing it, I'm stuck, and I got to figure out and wait, and so they go off somewhere and then they choose to vote by proxy. Would the gentleman from Kentucky agree that that pressure was at play and that that also feeds very much into the whole question of why, when you change the way we do our work environments, that it changes, the pressures that brought to play for those who have the obligation to do the job?
Absolutely. I agree 100%. Spoken very well, Joe.
With that, I will yield back.